back with you, and I'm so glad that we are able to have Bible study again together. I will admit that again, I am not happy with this medium, but I am glad that we are able to be together. It feels like this was a long Christmas break. I think it's the amount of time we normally take, but it feels a little bit longer than previous years. So it's good to be back together. We spent the first part of our year working through Genesis 1 through 19. And we ended 2020 appropriately on a bit of a downer, ending at the end of chapter 19. And so I hope that today's lesson will be a bit more positive, and we'll be able to see some kind of I mean, every way that God works is good, but maybe some more positive ways that we'll see God at work in these two chapters that we're looking at today. Before we get started in that, I want us to just do a little bit of review to remind ourselves where we were and to look forward to where we're going. So I want to just do a quick recap of kind of the structure of Genesis and what happens in those sections. So the first part of Genesis, Genesis 1 through 11, is called the Primeval History, if you remember that. So remember, it covers a huge chunk of time, thousands of years. It covers four main stories. And those four main stories are the creation and fall story as one. The second story that it covers is the story of Cain and Abel. The third story that is covered is the story of the flood. And the final story that we look at in that first section of Genesis is the Tower of Babel. So those are kind of the four main points that we see in Genesis 1 through 11. And as we were studying these, we noticed a bit of a theme start to emerge, a bit of a pattern start to emerge. And that is that people sin, that God goes to punish them, but before he punishes them, he covers his punishment in grace, that he shows them grace. What we learned is that Genesis actually is a book about grace. Now, who was the main character of those first 11 chapters? Can we all remember? Of course we know the main character is God himself. From the very beginning, from the first words of this book, in the beginning, who? God. We are established right from the beginning, the main character of this story is God. And so we saw that as we looked at the first 11 chapters of Genesis. Then we moved into the second section of Genesis. We see this shift happen from, it happens in Genesis 11:27. We see a shift from this primeval history and we move into the patriarchal history. And that history goes from chapter 12, 11:27 through the end of the book, through chapter 50. And what we see in this section is that instead of we're following main stories, we follow main characters, four in particular. The first, who we've already spent time studying, is Abraham. Our second main character, who was introduced today, is Isaac. Thirdly, Jacob. And then fourth, we spend a lot of time on Joseph at the end of Genesis. Our story with Abraham is coming to a close. We have a couple more weeks with him present. Next week is sort of his last main parts, but he's still around, kind of closing up his life after that in the following couple of chapters. And then we'll shift to Isaac for a short time and then spend quite a bit of time on Jacob and Joseph. Again, as we were studying the patriarchs, as we've already seen, we see also that these are stories of sin, but really it's stories of grace. We see as these patriarchs are moving through their lifespan, we see how God is trying to right the wrong of sin, and he's doing it through the lives of these men, and he's fulfilling his promises through the lives of these patriarchs and covering their lives with grace. And so what we see again is that the story of Genesis is a story of grace. Do you all remember, there's a term that's been thrown out several times this year that I wanted to bring up once again, and that is the term chiastic structure. You'll see on your handout, I gave you the chiasm, or the chiastic structure of Abraham's life. This means basically that there's symmetrical stories in his life. And the point of that is that when we see this symmetry, that it would point us to look at the center point of his life. Where are these stories pointing to? Because that is going to show us what the main point is, what the main story that the writer, Moses, and God want us to focus on. You'll see here that I gave you kind of the structure, the chiastic structure of Abraham's life. And you'll see that as we go through these stories, it's pointing us to the covenants that Abraham made in chapters 15 and 17, and how those covenants relate to his two sons. And we'll get more into that today. The reason I wanted to bring this up is because when we're studying our passage today, especially chapter 20, many of us are going to say, this feels a bit like deja vu. Haven't we already gone through this? Especially because I'm the one who taught this very similar story when we did it in chapter 12. So you're going to go, I'm sure she's already said this. And it's because, yes, I have already said this. This is because it's the parallel story to what is happening in chapter 12. What we're seeing is sort of the back end of Abraham's story. We're seeing the closing up shop. And as we see these stories repeated and these themes repeated, it should remind us to look back, okay, what's that main story then? What was the center story of Abraham's life that we should be focusing on? So while these stories are slightly different, of course, they're not identical stories to what we've looked at in chapter 12. It will be very reminiscent of the things that have already happened. So today we're going to be, what we're going to see is we're going to look at that second C, chapter 20, Sarah and Abimelech, and then that second, we're going to start in on that second B, abandoning future in faith. So before I move on, I wanted to make note of one thing from chapter 19. As I was studying for today, I came across this interesting fact, and so interesting insight into the end of chapter 19. And I wanted to bring it up before we move into our study for today, so that we can sort of close up shop on Lot in a bit of a different perspective. At the end of chapter 19, if you remember, Lot finds himself in a cave with his two daughters. Sodom and Gomorrah have been destroyed. Lot has lost almost everything. He's lost his wife, his great wealth. He is literally living in a cave with his two daughters. The fiancés of his daughters are also dead in Sodom. He told them, hey, come with me, and they don't believe Lot. And so they stay in Sodom and are destroyed along with the city. And what we find out about Lot's daughters is that they too, having grown up in Sodom, are women of Sodom. And so they concoct this plan that they look at their life and they go, hey, we have no other choice. The only thing we can do is kind of convince our father by making him super drunk and sort of unaware of his circumstances to father children for us. And so I don't know how Lot allowed this to happen twice. He must have been so drunk he didn't even know any of it happened. And he fathers children for his two sons, for his daughters, becoming both father and grandfather in one instance. What we find out at the end of chapter 19 is that the older daughter's son's name is Moab. Now, if you remember, that name should be sort of a bright light for us, and should us living on the other side of scripture, it should point out something. Who is an important Moabite figure in the Old Testament? Who comes to mind?
Ruth.
That is she's an important name, isn't she? Who is she? She is a Moabite woman who, in faith, goes to care for her mother-in-law, Naomi, after they both are widowed. And she ends up, through obedience and steadfast love for Naomi, she ends up in the line of King David. She is his great-grandmother. A Moabite woman becomes the great-grandmother of a king. And because she's in the line of David, she also then is in the line of Jesus. And so what we see as we close up shop on Lot's life is that not only is God punishing Lot's circumstances and the place where he lived in Sodom, but he's also covering Lot in grace. Something that Lot didn't know, something that Moses didn't even know, but that God gives us a hint into is that God is going to even cover Lot's story with grace and say, I am going to even redeem this situation by putting one of Lot's descendants in the line of Jesus. So it's just a beautiful gift that God gives of showing that he can redeem all situations, even this horrible incestuous relationship that takes place. God says, I'm going to even redeem that, and I'm going to use someone from that line in the line of my son. So I saw that and I just thought, man, I really want to share that with someone. Our God is so gracious and kind. So let's get into what we're studying today, which is Genesis 20 and 21. I am going to read all of chapter 20. After this, I'm going to rely on you to do some reading, but I will read 20 and then we'll start to break it apart. So this is Genesis 20, starting in verse 1. It says, now Abraham moved on from there into the region of the Negev and lived between Kadesh and Shur. For a while, he stayed in Gerar, and there Abraham said of his wife Sarah, she is my sister. Then Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent for Sarah and took her. But God came to Abimelech in a dream one night and said to him, you are as good as dead because of the woman you have taken. She is a married woman. Now, Abimelech had not gone near her, so he said, Lord, will you destroy an innocent nation? Did he not say to me, she is my sister? And didn't she also say, he is my brother? I have done this with a clear conscience and clean hands. Then God said to him in a dream, yes, I know you did this with a clear conscience, and so I have kept you from sinning against me. This is why I did not let you touch her. Now return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you will live. But if you do not return her, you may be sure that you and all yours will die. Early the next morning, Abimelech summoned all his officials, and when he told them all that had happened, they were very much afraid. Then Abimelech called Abraham in and said, what have you done to us? How have I wronged you that you have brought such great guilt upon me and my kingdom? You have done things to me that should not be done. And Abimelech asked Abraham, what was your reason for doing this? Abraham replied, I said to myself, there is surely no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she really is my sister, the daughter of my father, though not of my mother, and she became my wife. And then God had me wander from my father's household. And when God had me wander from my father's household, I said to her, this is how you can show your love to me. Everywhere we go, say of me, he is my brother. Then Abimelech brought sheep and cattle and male and female slaves and gave them to Abraham. And he returned Sarah, his wife, to him. And Abimelech said, my land is before you. Live wherever you like. To Sarah, he said, I am giving your brother 1,000 shekels of silver. This is to cover the offense against you before all who are with you. You are completely vindicated. Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, and his slave girls so they could have children again. For the Lord had closed up every womb in Abimelech's household because of Abraham's wife, Sarah. Okay, so I told you this would feel like deja vu. I'm sure it does. In fact, even more so, again, because I taught this already, so I'm very sorry that we didn't switch up 12 and 20 with different people. But again, we need to remember as we're reading the story that it should be reminding us to point back to, okay, what's the center of the story? And it should be reminding us to think back on the covenants and how it impacts this story as well. So before we dive in, let's set the stage a little bit as to where we are. Do you remember what happened in chapter 18? 3 visitors came to Abraham, and they tell Sarah that she is going to have a son. They don't just bring this great news, they also put a time period on it. They say that this child is going to be born at the same time next year, exactly 1 year from their visit. Then they go even further than that, and they give that child a name. They say his name is going to be Isaac. Since that visit, a lot has happened. Abraham has pled for Sodom, and since God couldn't find even 10 righteous people there, he destroys Sodom and Gomorrah while at the same time rescuing Lot. So a lot has happened in Abraham's life since the visit of these 3 angels, or whomever they were. It can't have been very long since this visit of the angels. Maybe at this point Sarah is pregnant. Maybe we don't know. We don't know how long it has been. If she is pregnant, it's very possible that Abraham does not know that she is pregnant yet. So we're assuming it's not very many months after the visit from the angels at the very most. So Abraham moves at the beginning of chapter 20. He spent the last 25 years, it's been 25 years since he left Haran to go to the promised land. He spent the last 25 years living in approximately the same place that he landed in after he split the land with Lot. But for some reason, he decides to move. We're not given the reason for his move. We just know that he does. So we find out that he moves to a place called Gerar. There is a map on your handout, and I forget what number is. There's a number there kind of showing his journey between the 4 and the 5 near Beersheba. You'll see Gerar there on kind of the southwest. So that's where Abraham goes to live. When he goes to Gerar, he finds there's a king there named Abimelech. Abimelech is actually not his name. It is his title. Means my father is king. And that is important to note because we run into another Abimelech in another very similar story with Isaac. And so Isaac will also interact with another Abimelech years later, but probably that was this Abimelech's son or grandson. So Abraham and Sarah move themselves to Gerar, and Sarah quickly gains the attention of the king there. I just want to say that I am so curious as to what this woman, this 90-year-old woman, must have looked like, who is attracting kings at 90 years old. I just really want to meet her. I think I'm going to seek her out in heaven and just get a good view of this woman and be like, yep, she deserved it. But Abimelech, believing that Sarah is single, takes her into his harem. He would have been completely fine to do this because he did believe that she was single. She was, in his view, an unmarried 90-year-old woman who had no children. So if she has no children, probably she's always been single is what he sees. She's available to him. Unfortunately for Abimelech, he has been lied to. He has been lied to not just by Abraham, but also by Sarah. So before we get into the interaction between Abimelech and God in Abimelech's dream, I want to talk about the covenant for a little bit. Imagine what Abraham must be thinking at this point. God has promised him with very clear language that Abraham and Sarah together are going to have a son. And they're going to have him at a specific time, 1 year from these 3 visitors coming to their house. We don't know how much time has passed, but we're imagining probably just a few months at the most. It's probably very soon after this visit. And another reason we think it's very soon is because this chapter goes to great lengths to point out that this child could not be Abimelech's. It is definitely not Abimelech's child. Isaac is definitely Abraham's son. This chapter really makes that emphasis. What else do we know about Abraham at this point? We know that Genesis 15:6, that Abraham believes God's promises. It says he believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. So Abraham is believing that this promise given to him in chapter 12, given to him in 15, given to him again in 18, that it's going to be fulfilled. He believes that. So we must think that Abraham believes, I really am going to have a son with Sarah 1 year from this visit. So he believes that, but there seems to be a screw loose somewhere, doesn't there? For some reason, Abraham does not believe that God is going to protect him and Sarah from Abimelech. So Abraham thinks he must lie. I don't understand that. And yet I very much understand that. I know that I believe God's promises. And yet, so many times I have chosen to create my own path because I think that maybe God didn't think of this one thing that's coming about and that I have to create the solution. Probably God needs my help in fixing this problem. And so I have to create a way out of it. What happens when we do that? Well, thankfully, unlike Abraham, it is not recorded for billions of people to read. But it doesn't go well when we do that, when we decide to make our own solution and go against the way that God has directed us to go. But even with Abraham and Sarah's lie, it does not stop God from fulfilling his covenantal promise. Remember from Genesis 15 that God walked through those sacrificed animals and put the entire burden of the covenant on his shoulders. If anyone broke the covenant, if God broke the covenant, if Abraham broke the covenant, it was God's responsibility. He was the one who was taking the entire burden of that covenant on himself. If Sarah is with Abimelech and gets pregnant by Abimelech, then God has broken his word because he said he was going to fulfill that covenant and give Abraham and Sarah a child together. It would be God's burden to carry. And so God intervenes in the midst of Abraham and Sarah's lie. He is not going to let this covenant be destroyed by their sin. He's not going to allow their sin to disrupt his purposes. That is the way God works. Our sin is not stronger than his purposes. We as people are not able to send God into a tailspin where he wonders how he's going to get himself out of a problem. No, our God is sovereign. He is in control. He is the one who is directing and orchestrating things. We have free will, truly we do, but it does not supersede his sovereignty. Meaning here we see Abraham exercising his free will. He does what he thinks is right, what he thinks is best for himself, for his own safety. But God stops the consequences before they disrupt his purposes, because God is still sovereign. And the way that God chooses to do that is by talking to Abimelech. He speaks to Abimelech in a dream. Now, I want to make a note that I don't think that this passage, we sort of sometimes talk about prescriptive passages and descriptive passages. So I don't think that this passage here is prescriptive, meaning I don't think that we need to prepare ourselves for God to speak to us in dreams all the time. And every morning you should wake up and write down your dreams and look and wonder, oh, how is God speaking to me through these? I think this is descriptive. It's just telling us what God did do. However, it is amazing that God has not retired this practice. He still speaks to people in dreams even now. We see that God is often doing that in the Muslim world, and that's how he speaks to people and how Muslims are saved and come to faith in Jesus, is that he is using this method. But again, this is a descriptive passage where God's telling us what he did do, not what he is necessarily going to do in our lives. So God speaks to Abimelech in a dream. The first thing God says to Abimelech is, "You are a dead man." That would be a pretty dramatic way to start the dream, and I'm sure it really grabbed Abimelech's attention. God is laying out the seriousness of the situation here. This isn't just any married woman that Abimelech has taken for himself. This is the married woman who is going to give birth to a child, to the child of promise, and it is important that Abimelech does not touch her. Abimelech rightly tells God that he is innocent. He has no idea that he has done something wrong. And we start to get the picture here, a very interesting picture, which is that Abimelech in this passage is viewed as the righteous person, and Abraham is clearly the unrighteous party. The one who has been credited with righteousness, as we've seen back in chapter 15, Abraham, has done something horrible to Abimelech. And Abimelech, who Abraham will later see says he certainly can't be one who fears God, has done nothing wrong. And what God tells Abimelech in verse 6 is something very amazing. He says, "I know that you did this with a clear conscience, and so I have kept you from sinning against me." God tells Abimelech, "I have been protecting you because I know that you are not trying to sin against me. You are not trying to do this to me. And so I stopped you from doing even further sin." However, God does require something of Abimelech. He tells Abimelech to go to Abraham and ask Abraham to pray for him. This is the first time that we see the word prophet used in scripture. And it is used about a man who has just lied through his teeth and hurt someone else in the process. It's sort of astounding to me that this is how God chooses to use this word prophet for the first time. But it's evidence that God is using broken people to accomplish his purposes. Abraham, despite his sin, has been credited with righteousness. He is legally right in the sight of God. He has been justified. And so God is going to use him. God is going to use him to accomplish his purposes. Can you imagine what Abimelech must be thinking at this point? I would have been so salty towards Abraham. I would not have been able to humble myself and go before him and say, "Pray for me because this horrible thing you did to me has caused me to be in trouble. And so can you intervene before God for me?" Which is what Abimelech has to do. He has to ask Abraham to intervene with God, to pray for him. Makes me sick to my stomach to think of having to do that. And yet that is what God asks Abimelech to do. Abraham's sin has affected much more than Abraham. It is rare that when we sin, our sinful consequences are limited just to us. Sin spreads, sin affects other people. Just like here, with Abraham's sin affecting not only Abimelech, not only Sarah, but the entire household of Abimelech, and perhaps even the whole nation from Abraham's lie. His sin has permeated everything. And that is true for us too. Sometimes I think when we sin against one person, I'll just apologize to that person and then it's okay. But we forget there's probably a lot of people who have been affected by our sin. And so there's a lot of reconciliation that needs to take place. Sin affects always a community and not just one person. Abimelech even says to Abraham, "Why did you do this to me? What did I ever do to you?" To which Abraham has no response. He gives a reason, but it's not a good one. He says that the reason that he lied was because Abimelech, he didn't imagine that Abimelech feared God. He says that he didn't think he was coming to a place where the community, where they were aware, where they were worshiping God and were reverent of God. And yet what this story is showing us is that really the opposite has taken place. Abimelech is showing fear of God, and Abraham is not. Because if he had been fearing God, he wouldn't have told this lie in the first place. He would have trusted God to protect Sarah and their forthcoming child through their time in Gerar with Abimelech. We're seeing yet again that Abimelech is the righteous one, and Abraham is acting unrighteously. And yet still Abraham is credited with righteousness. The end of this chapter makes me really mad. I want people to get what is due them. I want them to be punished for their sin. I want to see justice. I want to see fairness. But thankfully, our God does not work that way. He does not work that way with me. He does not work that way with you. And thankfully, he did not work that way with Abraham either. Instead, we see him receive, just like he did at the end of chapter 12, extravagant wealth from his lie. Abimelech heaps on him sheep and cattle, more slaves, and on top of that, he gives 1,000 shekels of silver, which would be approximately 20 times the typical bride price for what he did to Sarah. In addition to that, Abimelech gives Abraham an open invitation to his land. And we're going to see at the end of chapter 21 that Abraham uses that invitation. Abimelech says, "You can go in my land wherever you want. You can live wherever you want." That's what Abraham gets from his sin. It's amazing. But what does Abraham really get? Outside of the wealth, what does Abraham really get? He gets a God who has protected and preserved the covenant that they share together. He gets his promised son, as we'll see at the beginning of the next chapter. The point of this, what Abimelech is constantly saying, "Hey, it wasn't me. I never touched her. I didn't get involved with your wife." What we're seeing is God emphasizing this is Abraham and Sarah's child that is coming. I have not broken my covenant with them. I really am blessing the two of them, these two people who are past the time of having children. I am going to bless them with a child. Abraham, we see, does end up praying for Abimelech. And we see an instance of God starting to fulfill Genesis 12:3, where he says, "Through Abraham, all nations will be blessed." And we get a foreshadowing of what's to come in the next few verses. At the end of chapter 20, verse 17 says, "Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, and his slave girls, so they could have children again. For the Lord had closed up every womb in Abimelech's household because of Abraham's wife, Sarah." Back in Genesis 16:2, Sarah notes that the Lord has kept me from having children. Sarah believes, and it probably is true because of the way that he works later in life, is that God has kept Sarah from having children up until this point, just like he does here with Abimelech's family. He stops them from being able to have children because of Sarah entering their household. But what we see is that the God who shuts also is the God who opens. That where something couldn't live, God brings life. He opens the womb of the women in Abimelech's household, so that they yet again are able to have children. And it gives us a foreshadowing of what is about to happen with Sarah, that same thing is going to happen with Sarah, that her womb, which was once barren, which was once dead, which was once closed, now God is going to bring life from it. Okay, we're going to be moving on now into Genesis 21. Does anyone have any comments on Genesis 20? Comments, questions, anything before we move on to chapter 21?
I do.
Yes, go ahead.
Question, was there any, I didn't study this, look at what anybody else thought about it, but was there a thought that was noted that God had closed all the wombs of all the women so that it could never come as a sort of refutation that, or refusal that Abraham is the father of Isaac? You know, that someone would say, oh, Sarah was in Abimelech's harem around that time, and so this child is not Abraham's, it's Abimelech's. So all these other women say, no, all of our wombs were closed. Nobody got pregnant during that entire time. I don't know. I just thought that's a weird thing for that to be at the end, that it's noted that nobody conceived during that time at all.
Yeah, I didn't see anything specifically about that, but most commentators wrote, like, the point of this is to show Abimelech is definitely not the father of Isaac. That is Abraham for sure. And so I'm sure that, it was clear these women knew, hey, I'm not able to have children right now. Something is wrong here. And so, and they knew they were healed as well. So I would assume that would be a good train of logic for sure.
The other thing I thought of when I read this was when we did Romans last year, and I was trying to look and see where it was, and it's in 9, that it says, God will have mercy on whom he will have mercy. You know, like it's really strange that he had mercy on Abimelech and that he had mercy on Abraham in this, you know, and that Abimelech is kind of the hero in this story, and he's not of God. He doesn't worship God, but God had mercy on him, you know, and he had mercy on Abraham in making it so that everything was fine with Sarah, even though he had sinned against God and against Sarah, really, even though Sarah was complicit and lied too. So God, it's really great that our performance, you know, or lack thereof, isn't tied to God's purposes being fulfilled, you know, that's merciful of him to kind of make sure that even if we sin, his purposes are going to be fulfilled because he's merciful to us. He doesn't strike us dead when we sin against him. He shows mercy and allows his purposes to go forth regardless of us.
Yeah, and then chooses to use Abraham as a conduit of grace to Abimelech, even though he has been sinning throughout this. And even when he's confronted with his sin by Abimelech, he gives excuses. And yet still God says, I'm going to allow you to be a conduit of grace to this nation, to Abimelech's nation, and says, I'm going to give you the ability to bless them through your family, and opens up, takes away the punishment of their sin away from them by asking God to do that. And so, God gives grace after grace to Abraham, even when Abraham is being completely unfaithful to God.
I wonder too, what could have happened had Abram been faithful and not told a lie. You know, I think sometimes in our lives, God can redeem our mistakes, but what could be even better had we been obedient?
Yeah, and I think we're going to see that next week, what Abraham's obedience does look like, and how God does something miraculous through Abraham's obedience. I think that's a great that's what we're going to get to see next week. We don't know what would have happened in this situation, but we do know what happens in chapter 22 when Abraham is obedient.
And eventually, isn't Israel to be the light to the nations? So he should have been a light, Abram.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, he should have been not just, blessing the nations through praying for them and taking away the punishment for their sin that they unknowingly committed, but should have been showing them who God was by being faithful to God instead of by sinning against Abimelech in the way he did by lying to him. Yes, I agree with you. He should have been a light to the nations. Any other comments on chapter 20? All right, if I could get someone to help me out and read chapter 21, verses 1 through 7.
Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abram in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son of Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. And she added, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children, yet I have borne him a son in his old age.
Okay, so we find out immediately that God has fulfilled his promise to Abraham and Sarah, and that Isaac is born. Look at those first two verses. We can get some more information about this. We see that somehow God has supernaturally caused Sarah and Abraham to conceive Isaac. Even though they've been married for at least, but probably more than 25 years, and they have had no children during that time. This child is born as a result of God's promise and God's intervention. He's referred to later in the New Testament as he's the child of promise, but also the child of the Spirit is sort of the parallel that's given. That people later who are saved in the Spirit and are in the line of Abraham, and that this child was, in a sense, born by power of the Spirit as well, because he was born as a result of God's intervention. Listen to how Moses emphasizes God's faithfulness. He says it 3 times. He says, as he had said, what he had promised, and at the very time God had promised him. He's really driving home the point that God has fulfilled the covenant that he made with Abraham. He protected Sarah from Abimelech, and now he has enabled her to have a child, to have Isaac. Abraham does exactly then what he is supposed to do. He names him Isaac and circumcises him on the 8th day. Isaac is the first little baby then to be circumcised as God has promised as God has commanded on the 8th day after they're born. And we see that pattern then. It's in the law of Moses, and then we see that pattern. We see Jesus also is then circumcised on the 8th day. And then what we see is that Sarah rejoices in what almost sounds like a song in those last 2 verses of this section. And then it's over. This long-awaited birth takes 7 verses, and then it's over. I was hoping for a little bit more, but that's all we get. But the main point is there. And the main point is that God is faithful, and that God did exactly what he said he was going to do. Exactly what he said he was going to do. He fulfilled his purposes. He lived up to his side, which was also Abraham's side of the covenant. Now I want to kind of draw in, kind of extrapolate out from this passage a bit and draw in another passage. If you turn to 1 Samuel, chapter 2, we'll see what happens, how another barren woman talks about what God has done to her after she has had a child. This is the Song of Hannah. after Samuel's born, after she takes him to the temple to be dedicated to the Lord. She says, chapter 2, verses 5 and 6. She says, those who are full hire themselves out for food, but those who are hungry hunger no more. She who was barren has borne 7 children, but she who has had many sons pines away. The Lord brings death and makes alive. He brings down to the grave and raises up. So there's a comparison that Hannah's making here between a barren womb and death. And that God has brought things back to life, that God brings life out of a barren womb, that God raises from the dead. He did exactly what he did for Hannah is what he did for Sarah. And that point is made also in Romans 4. So if you turn to Romans 4, we're going to look at verses 16 through 22 very briefly. Romans 4, 16 through 22 say, therefore the promise comes by faith, so that it may be by grace and may be guaranteed to all Abraham's offspring, not only to those who are of the law, but also to those who are of the faith of Abraham. He is the father of us all. As it is written, I have made you a father of many nations. He is our father in the sight of God, in whom he believed. The God who brings life, who gives life to the dead and calls things that are not as though they were. Against all hope, Abraham in hope believed, and so became the father of many nations, just as it has been said to him, so shall your offspring be. Without weakening in his faith, he faced the fact that his body was as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, and that Sarah's womb was also dead. Yet he did not waver through unbelief regarding the promise of God, but was strengthened in his faith and gave glory to God, being fully persuaded that God had power to do what he had promised. This is why it was credited to him as righteousness. God brings life to the dead and calls things that are not as though they were. That's what God did here. He brought life to Sarah's womb. This thing that should have been dead in this 90-year-old woman, that she recognizes that perhaps God had closed, that God was the one who made this thing not able to work. But he brought life from her. He brought her womb back to life. He accomplished his purposes in an impossible situation. Isaac's birth here is a foreshadowing of resurrection. Life coming from death. It's showing that our God is the one who takes dead things and makes them alive. And praise God that he does that. He's saying my covenant involves bringing dead things back to life. And that's what we see when we come to faith. We who are dead are brought back to life in Christ. All right, we're going to move on to our next section. Can someone read for me chapter 21, verses 8 through 21? This next section about Hagar and Ishmael.
The child grew and was weaned, and on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was mocking. And she said to Abraham, get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac. The matter distressed Abraham greatly, because it concerned his son. But God said to him, do not be so distressed about the boy and your maidservant. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the maidservant into a nation also, because he is your offspring. Early the next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He sent them on her shoulders and then sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. Then she went off and sat down nearby, about a bow shot away, for she thought, I cannot watch the boy die. And as she sat there nearby, she began to sob. God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the desert and became an archer. While he was living in the desert of Paran, his mother got a wife for him from Egypt.
Thank you, Megan. So as you're reading this section, maybe you feel a little bit strange, a little bit gross, because that's how I feel when I read it. I don't like how this passage works out. I don't like how everyone acts in it. But after studying a bit, I think I understand it a little bit more than I have in the past. This is the story about how Hagar and Ishmael are sent out of Abraham's household. About 3 years have passed between verse 7 and verse 8. Isaac is now 3 years old, which is the typical time frame when a child would be weaned in the ancient Near East. And so Abraham and Sarah throw a great party to celebrate that Isaac is weaned. So if 3 years has passed, that means that Ishmael is 16 years old at this point. And at the party, 16-year-old Ishmael starts mocking his little brother. That word mock in verse 9, maybe your version says it differently, is the same root word as Isaac's name. So what it's saying here is that Ishmael is maliciously laughing at little Isaac. Sarah observes this happening and tells Abraham that it's time for Hagar and Ishmael to leave. She tells Abraham that Ishmael is not to take part, is not to share in the blessing or the inheritance that is due to Isaac. Now this might make you all a bit uncomfortable. After all, Ishmael is the oldest son. He is the one who should be getting the firstborn inheritance, especially because Sarah gave Hagar to Abraham sort of as her surrogate. So Ishmael should be viewed as Abraham's official firstborn son. But Sarah is telling Abraham that Isaac is supposed to get this inheritance. Why? Commentators disagree about whether Sarah is in the right or in the wrong here. Probably as you read it, you see her as a mean woman. And so I'm going to give you the opposite of view. Because if you already think she's mean, then I'm going to tell you that she's doing the right thing. And then you can decide what you think for yourself. I always read her as being horrible, just as she has been in the previous parallel story where Hagar leaves when she's pregnant because Sarah's being cruel to her. So we sort of think, oh, well, Sarah was cruel in the past. Maybe she's also being cruel here. But we see a different reaction from Abraham and God. And so we are led to believe that that she is not being cruel here, but that she's reacting appropriately. Sarah knew something about Isaac that was special. Isaac, as we've already said, is the child of promise. He's the one that the promise given in Genesis 3:15, given in Genesis 12:3, was going to be passed through. It was not going to be through Ishmael. It was going to be through this child who was born by the intervention of God. And Sarah knew that. She also knew that Ishmael was a threat to Isaac by the way Ishmael's treating Isaac. And so what Sarah's doing here is protecting Isaac. She's protecting the child of promise. Paul shares Sarah's opinion here, and he quotes her in Galatians 4:29. He quotes exactly what she says here, that the slave woman's son will not share in the inheritance with the child of promise. With the child of the free woman is how Paul puts it. So Ishmael, while he is a physical child of Abraham, was not the child of promise. He was the threat to Isaac. So Sarah's protecting her son and getting the threat out of the house. This also has kind of a parallel idea in 1 Samuel as well. In 1 Samuel 18, Jonathan, the oldest son of King Saul, realizes that David is the one who's going to be the next king, not him. In a sense, David, his best friend, is going to dethrone him. And Jonathan does the right thing here, where Ishmael does not. Jonathan steps aside, and he symbolically transfers that position, the kingship, to David. He gives him the symbols of the kingship, of his right place. He gives all of those possessions to David and says, these are yours now. So Jonathan submits to the will of God and says, I recognize that in the world's law, I'm supposed to be the next king. Just like Ishmael saying, hey, in the way the world works, I should be the firstborn receiving the great inheritance. But what Jonathan does rightly and Ishmael does wrongly, Jonathan recognizes it's not for me, it's for him. And so I'm going to step aside. I'm going to be obedient to the will of God, and I'm going to give that to David. And Ishmael chooses not to do that, instead maliciously mocking his little brother. So that's what Ishmael should have done. And if he had, maybe he wouldn't have been kicked out of the house. But God supports Sarah's statement to Abraham here. And God tells Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael away. He also gives Abraham a promise that Ishmael will not lose out on the blessings that were promised to Abraham. Ishmael too will become a great nation. Look at the growth we've seen in Abraham since just the last chapter. Abraham did not trust God to protect Sarah in the last chapter. But now Abraham is trusting God, that God is going to do the right thing in both the lives of his two sons. And so he lets Ishmael go. This is a son he loved deeply. This is not a distant son that he spent no time with. This is a son he has been with for his whole life. For 16 years, he has loved his son Ishmael, and he lets him go. He submits to the will of God and sends Ishmael and Hagar away. What we see here is that maybe God is preparing Isaac to release not just his older son, but the son of promise as well. But we'll look at that next week. Verse 14 gives us a very sad scene of Abraham by himself going out to say goodbye to Hagar and Ishmael as they leave. Hagar and Ishmael then wander in the desert until their supplies run out, and Hagar walks away from her son as he lies weeping and dying. God then comes to Hagar and tells her that he is going to fulfill his promise and make Ishmael into a great nation. This is now Hagar's second conversation with God. And what does she do? She goes to Egypt and finds an Egyptian wife for Ishmael. Even God's one-on-one conversations with Hagar do not convince her to submit to him, to follow him, to try to be near those who follow him. She gets far away from Abraham instead of trying to provide a believing wife for her son. She goes and finds an Egyptian wife for him. Verse 20 says that God was with Ishmael. This is not a picture of relationship with Ishmael. It's God's protection is what it means, is that God is protecting Ishmael so that he will grow up and become a great nation. And we don't get the idea that Ishmael enters into a relationship with God like Abraham has. And so that concludes this sad story of Hagar and Ishmael being sent out of the household of Abraham. So now Abraham views himself as having just this one son, Isaac. All right, one last section. If someone would read Genesis 21, 22 through 34.
At that time, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, said to Abraham, God is with you in all that you do. Now therefore swear to me here by God that you will not deal falsely with me or with my descendants or with my posterity, but as I have dealt kindly with you, so you will deal with me and with the land where you have sojourned. And Abraham said, I will swear. When Abraham reproved Abimelech about the well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized, Abimelech said, I do not know who has done this thing. You did not tell me, and I have not heard of it until today. So Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two men made a covenant. Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock apart, and Abimelech said to Abraham, what is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs that you have set apart? He said, these 7 ewe lambs you will take from my hand, and this may be a witness for me that I dug this well. Therefore, that place was called Beersheba, because both of them swore an oath. So they made a covenant at Beersheba. Then Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, rose up and returned to the land of the Philistines. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham sojourned many days in the land of the Philistines.
Thank you. So I know what many of you are thinking at this point. Oh, I'm so glad she left time at the end to talk about this treaty. I have been so curious about it. I love studying treaties. This is so great. Plus, I've been really wondering what happened to Abimelech. I know that's what you're all thinking. The good thing is, though, I actually did learn something here about this, and I did not understand why this was included in scripture at all, but thankfully commentators are smart, and we can learn from them what God has to say through stories like this that maybe to us make no sense. So in order to understand this story, we have to rewind back to Genesis 15 and look again at the covenant that God has established with Abraham. So what is the covenant? Genesis 15, what are the 2 promises that God has been making to Abraham? The first is that Abraham is going to have a son. So Isaac is promised there. Well, we see in chapter 21, the beginning of chapter 21, that Isaac is born. So God has fulfilled that part of the covenant. But the second part is about the land. The second part of the covenant is that God is going to give the land to Abraham's descendants. He makes the point, though, that he is not going to give the land to Abraham, that Abraham will not get to enjoy it. That is, remember, he says it's going to be 400 years that your descendants are in slavery, and then they're going to come back, and they're going to have to deal with the Amalekites, I can't remember, and they're going to have to battle them, and then they're going to get the land. So what we're seeing here is that Abraham doesn't get the land. God is even fulfilling that part of the covenant with Abraham. The land is still not his. It's still Abimelech's. So basically what happens here is Abimelech and his people are treating Abraham poorly. Remember what we just read, he's promised Abraham, you can live wherever you want in my land, do whatever you want to do. And yet he doesn't live up to that, what he has said. He has been treating Abraham poorly and has stolen this well. We see a reversal of situations from what we saw in chapter 20. In this section, Abraham is the righteous party, clearly, and Abimelech, with all his denying and not taking responsibility for the fault, is the unrighteous party. So Abraham decides to extend grace and decides to try to bless Abimelech by establishing a covenant with him. Abimelech doesn't do very well with this treaty, but Abraham does extend grace to him. Again, starting to fulfill the promise of blessing the nations. Abraham is attempting to do that here. But again, the main point of this is that Abraham still does not have possession of the land. He, as we read in Hebrews 11, he only saw the promises and welcomed them from a distance. And yet, even in this story, we see that God is fulfilling his purposes. God told Abraham that he wasn't going to take possession of the land, and then he doesn't. So even in that, we see God's purposes being fulfilled. All right, that is all we're going to study today. We have one little exercise we may have time for, but does anyone have any comments or questions before we move on to that? About chapter 21. Kind of 3 little short stories there. All right, so we have in the last part of your handout, there's a little box there. And there's a question that says, how have I seen God fulfill his purposes in my life? So what I want you to do is think through, how have I seen God's purposes fulfilled? Maybe in a time that you sinned, like in chapter 20 with Abraham, or maybe in a time when you were obedient, like he was in chapter 21. What are some of the ways that you have seen God fulfilling his purposes? If you have one to share, I would love to hear it, to give testimony to what God has accomplished. We have probably 7 minutes to do that. While you're thinking, I'll give a short one in my life. It rewinds back a bit, but it'll catch up to nowadays, which is that when I was in college, I wanted to be an RA. And so I applied with my roommate at the time, and we were going to be co-RAs together. And she was very excited about it. I was very excited about it. And we were going through the process of application, and we were making it through the different interviews and everything. And all of a sudden, this opportunity to study abroad came to me. And I was given the opportunity to study abroad for an entire semester in France. And it was like the perfect situation. It was no extra money. It was, I wouldn't get behind in any of my classes. Everything was great. And I ended up studying abroad and having to tell my roommate, my best friend in college, I'm not going to RA with you. I'm not going to. And she was very upset, rightfully so. I was upset to not be able to do it with her, but very excited to be going to France. It was a hard decision that I had to make, and I wasn't sure that I had made the right one. But when I look back on it now, what I see is that God was using that decision to prepare me for living somewhere else. That he wanted me to figure out what it's like in a very safe circumstance to live away from people I wanted to be with, to live in a place that was, I'd never taken a day of French in my life before I went to France, and that God is preparing me for that. And so that when it came to going to Tanzania, it was less of a leap than if I had never gone to France. And because I went to Tanzania, now God is working in my life to make me so much more obedient to him than if I hadn't had that experience. And so he changed my attitude towards people because of my time in Tanzania. I view people differently. And so God sort of used that series of events to fulfill his purposes in my life, to change me and mold me to look more like his son. So what are some of the ways that you also have seen God fulfilling his purposes in your life? Does anyone have a story they can share? All right, I'm gonna give you, I hope this is something you can think about. I want us always to be able to give testimony to God's greatness. And so what I'd like you to do is take time, think through that statement. And I hope that you can pick someone this week to share that story with, to be able to share, hey, this is how God has worked in my life. This is how I've seen his hand at work. And ultimately, this is how his purposes were fulfilled. Because that brings him glory, which is another one of his purposes anyway. So it was good to be with all of you this morning. I will let you know where we'll be this next week, whether we'll be in this Zoom room again, or if we'll be back in the sanctuary, I don't know yet. So I will keep you informed on that. But yeah, so it was good to be with all of you. Any other comments before we finish up? All right, thanks you all for coming, and I will see you all next week.
Thanks, Emily.
Thanks, Anne.